I'll try and reinforce as opposed to repeat the very good points of the previous speakers, but perhaps offer a bit of a different take on some of those issues from our recent experiences. Much of my analysis here will be contained in a forthcoming paper, which I'll write when I get the time, which will be called The New Black, a Study in Youth Exploitation and the Political Economy of Exclusion. So I was very interested to see some of the earlier statistics, both on the ground and in terms of the research base, as to exactly who is working in the periphery, as we once say, in the labour market. First things first, 10 years ago, actually a little bit more than 10 years ago, during the work choices onslaught and the Your Rights at Work campaign, we got a call from a young woman who was working at this restaurant called Chili's Restaurant in Wollongong, and it's gone into Your Rights at Work folklore since, because she was a young journalism student, and she wanted to interview me about a couple of matters at Rights at Work and the campaign and those things. Halfway through, she said, "So what would you say, like, if a young worker was only called in for 20 minutes at a time, told to go home?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to blame work choices, but you can't actually do that even under work choices. But it happens." "Well, I can't say that." "Well, what about if people were asked to bring their own float of $100, and if anyone did a runner, they had to take it out of their money bag?" And I'd say, "Well, great one, I'll have to remember that, but I don't really have any evidence of that." And she says, "Well, what if I do?" And I said, "Well, you're my new best friend." and I said, "Well, who have you heard this from? Who has it happened to?" And she said, "Me." Anyway, so we went and spoke with some of the other workers, and sure enough, the story checked out and got worse. And she said, "Well, can you do something with this?" And I said, "My word, I can do something with this. Do you think the media will be interested?" "Of course they'll be interested, and we're interested. But rather than me do this, I think it's going to have more effect if you do it. You're a young journalism student, right? Okay. Well, what if I can get you your first byline?" She goes, "You think so?" "I know so." "I'm pretty sure we'll be able to get it." She said, "Do you reckon the Mercury would be able to do that?" I said, "I'd be very surprised if national media." And of course it went national. It became almost the personification of young work exploitation under work choices at the time, like the absolute, way in which it all headed. The point of the story is this, it's twofold. One is to say that work choices wasn't just about the written word. It was about the narrative, it was about the power imbalance, it was about the fear and the intimidation. This is what a lot of people didn't get, that it was about saying to employers almost anything goes. And it went in tandem with the attack on unions because, of course, we defend workers, or workers organise to defend themselves. So you attack workers, you bring in these new laws, but you also bring in the fear and the intimidation and that power shift. That is a very big part of it. Let's fast forward 10 years, and in a great irony, many of you would have read the recent stories about youth exploitation in Wollongong, the young workers. One of the worst cases was the chain called the Outback Restaurant. Guess where Outback is? It's the exact same location as Chili's. Serious story. And it's also owned, like Chili's, by an American firm that's got all these franchises. So I'll get to that in a tick. So that was interesting in itself. But the second part of the point, being the fear and the intimidation and what have you, becomes very relevant here. Because a lot of the things that happen are not contained even in the current industrial relations laws. Employers get away with them because the power imbalance is so great. The fear and intimidation leads the worker, and particularly a young worker, to believe that even if it doesn't sound right, it is what's happening and it is what I have to do if I need a job. The basis of my analysis is this, that the hubs of young worker exploitation have a name. They're called universities. And this is what took us by surprise. we, and I say collectively in the union movement, but particularly on the South Coast, because we got high rates of youth unemployment, like many places in Victoria and elsewhere, we were looking for, in terms of examples of exclusion, in terms of those that didn't get to university and elsewhere. And we were missing a very big part of the story. And that is that employers have worked out that where you get that transient occupational group, which is students who have to, particularly the way in which both universities and assistance to students has gone in the last 30, 40 years, they're a desperate, very easily exploitable group who will put up with almost anything just to get some money, assuming they even get some allowances for their education, whatever else. And who are the most exploitable because even if they are lucky enough to be able to get some Centrelink or whatever else, they'll be able to do a deal in terms of a black economy. And the two are happening at the same time. Now, if you take that as a business model, one of the many in wage theft, and you stick it into a regional community, you amplify its effect and the incidences of exploitation. And it was only after the young people came forward to us, I have to say one young woman who's just absolutely stunned us, Ashley Mounser, in her 20s, and she was able to do what we couldn't do for very much the reasons that Killian talks about. Who's going to come into a dingy office beside Wollongong train station with a middle-aged union official and report? I mean, they're just not going to do it. But what they did do is they responded to young Ashley, who put on this chat room at the university. I wouldn't even know how to get into one of those things, and to say, you know what, I'm getting paid 15 cash in hand. Who else is getting that? Who else is getting that? She got some responses. She got some people who said 10, some 11. She got some people who said 4-week trial with $0. 4 weeks. I'm not talking about a shift or a day or a week. 4 weeks. And it just goes on and on. But what impressed us was that she did what we would call in the union movement mapping. She did a geographic map. That's what she did. It was an organising job from someone who didn't call themselves a unionist at that point. So I'm proud to say she's now a member of the union movement. But at that point, she just sort of said, okay, well, let's get all this together. So she got 61 businesses, 61 within 2 kilometre strip in Wollongong. Now, I'd have to say, if they were the ones that voluntarily came forward to report that cash in hand, the underpayments, imagine how many there actually are. We thought to ourselves, look, who the hell is paying the award rates? You know, it was that bad. It was that bad. So I'll fast forward a few bits because I know we're a little bit sort of short on time as well. But the interesting thing about her study was twofold. One, it was amazing that she actually got the list and that a lot of these young workers, not all of them, but most of them on that sheet of paper provided their mobile numbers and their names, which means they were pissed off. That was an important point to note, that was too much. The second interesting thing about that study was that you almost had a consciousness amongst those workers of what underpayment was a fair underpayment. Right? They'd actually worked out that $15 cash in hand they could all live with. Anything below that was an absolute rip-off. They weren't happy with $15. They just accepted the fact that if they didn't, go and accept it at the door, they wouldn't be getting through the front door to get a job. So this is just a case of, And when we had a discussion with them, their view was, well, what are you going to do? How can you change this? They don't have that view now, and I'll tell you why in a tick, but initially, that was their rationale. So the takeout of that for us was, hang on, so you've got young people who understand what's happening to them, they're prepared to cop it because they've got no choice, but they've also got a sense of working out a level that they're going to call the new black. Right? That's going to be their new level, and that was the most interesting part of the story, because they had worked out something that they were starting to organise around. Forget the fact that it wasn't the award for a moment, but the important thing was they were prepared to collect advice. And that was the beginnings of it, right? So that was the positive. That was the positive takeout. The negative, though, is what a huge threat this is to the industrial relations system. Don't get me wrong, the penalty rate thing has to be at the focus, but it has to be in the context of wage theft, which is what we're all doing. If we just look at penalty rate as a rate, we're missing the story here. Because just like there used to be a threat to our currency, you know, the little sort of plates with the holes in them, you know, in the early days, and, you know, people were worried about whether currency is going to survive. I mean, this is the Bitcoin option in industrial relations. This is a serious threat. You get 61 businesses in the centre of Wollongong doing this. That is a threat to our system. Who is going to be paying? Their competitors are going to be seriously thinking about switching business models from the legal one to the illegal one, because they know there are no penalties. Let's face it, there are no penalties. Unless the tax office gets in and whacks a few. The Ombudsman's already told us, by the way, the Ombudsman recently, 3 months after the expose, raided 80 businesses, and we're told used all the notes from the students. They didn't have any intel at all, right? But putting that aside. But if you think about it, this whole black economy is threatening what we do, right? And I strongly suspect that the latest moves by the government on unpaid internships is an admission of failure, really, and that they know that they know they're going to get hammered, and more of these cases are going to come up. And rather than respond to that threat, they're trying to legalise it. They're trying to go the other way and say, you know what, call it internship and away you go. We don't want to know. And that is a real danger. Moving along quickly. From what we saw, most of those issues are predominantly in hospitality. And this is the other part of that business model too. We were looking for the casual end. We honestly thought, well, this is going to be huge. You know, that's always been the union movement's big fear, the increase in casualisation. You know, it's gone all the way back. The ones that are actually paying legally, they're not paying casual rates. They're employing them as full-time permanents. Permanent full-time or permanent part-time. How can they do permanent full-time? Because we've now got 2-3 chains using zombie agreements. These are the agreements that were before Work Choices was dead, buried and cremated. Grilled was a great example in Victoria. But these guys aren't even worrying about the niceties. They're using pre-Work Choices agreements, which don't have, you can be employed as a part-time or as a permanent, and you could be working 2 hours a week. I kid you not. I mean, they are incredible, these agreements, able to totally override the award, and the only thing they have to be consistent with now are the national employment standards. But you need to have a current employee to challenge those. And you know how hard that is. So what we're actually looking at is employers who can skin those students even more by actually employing them as permanents. They don't have to pay them casual rates. That's a great way to do it. And they're employing, 2 or 3 hours here, 4 hours there, 8 hours there. No notion of any consistency in terms of expected sort of hours of work. Rosters, week in advance if you're lucky, and then up to 24 hours in urgent cases. And the Ombudsman's told us, no, that's actually legal. Sorry guys, that's legal. We're going to hopefully get to a test case on these things. So the second aspect is this notion of casualisation and permanency. It's almost like quantum physics and, relativity. Once you get into that youth end, they do their sums and they say, we can actually rip them off more, not by having them as casuals, but having them as permanent workers. The next aspect, no, I won't go into that. It'll take too long. There was another aspect here. Okay, so the other aspect is in terms of what happens with these students once they actually say something or do something. We know that the general reaction is, they just get sacked, right? So this was what we found with those students once they were contacted by the media. We just thought that'll go. No one's going to want to talk. Once Ashley had spoken once the media started ringing around, no one wanted to talk. Once Ashley spoke to them and said, look, I'm going to do it. I've spent a bit of time putting the 61 together. What the heck? I'm going to do it, you know. They all opened up. And they said, all right, well, if you're going to do it, we'll do it. That's nice for us because it's a sense of, you know, collectivism and solidarity amongst them all. Once the media started ringing them and they said, well, what are you working, what are you getting, etc. And they sort of said, so what were you supposed to be earning and getting and all that sort of stuff? They reverted back to being done over by what the boss had promised them, not in terms of the award. That whole notion, and supporting what you said, that whole notion of being aware was just almost non-existent. And in fact, when Unions New South Wales produced just a one-page sheet, age, casual rate, etc., right? And we started handing them out at orientation days. Everyone was taking them and coming back. You could tell just by looking in their eyes, they weren't getting that. But the other thing was, they thought it was a con. They thought, that can't be the legal rate. That's just what... No, that is the legal rate. Well, that, you know, okay, but what if they can't afford to pay that? This is the narrative, right? What if they can't afford to pay that? But what are they hearing in the news? Business owners saying they can't afford to pay the legal rate. So it's almost like this is the guide. So another key theme of that paper, once I write it, will be that notion that the award has become a best practice guide in the hospitality end, particularly in regional communities and mostly for young workers. So that's the other thing which is incredible, really. Just on that point, can I make two quick points on the aspect of aggregate demand, which was the other more so technical term, I guess, in terms of people's money in their pockets. And this is the undercurrent, and it's not new. The accord itself, you know, when Labor got in 1982, was it? 82, 83? It was a key part of that document. It was there in black and white that there needs to be a shift, right, from wages to profit. And that was based on what a lot of the business leaders had been saying up until that point, which they called a real wage overhang. That somehow there was a natural order and balance between wages and profits, labour and capital, and they put a fulcrum, and that fulcrum, I think from memory, was 1970, 71, I think they used the base year. Other times they used 66, 67. And they used this notion that, well, it's just gone so far towards labour, it's got to come back. That policy, or the Accord, and other policies were deliberately aimed to redressing that to drive investment and labour. So this notion now about, you know, sort of driving, you know, jobs and employment through taking money out of workers' pockets and back to business is not new. It's actually got a history itself. And one of the suggestions is maybe we ought to delve back and reverse it and talk about the real corporate or profit overhang. If we don't want to use those same base figures. So anyone, particularly the economists in the room, who may want to have a look at some of those base years, that might be one way to do it. But that narrative about the bosses being paid too much, the workers getting paid too much is the undercurrent with these. Let me quickly talk about Outback. And this is my third and final point here without getting into some of the other aspects. It's one thing for young workers to be exploited, to be ripped off. It is another use of taxpayers' money to prop up and finance a business model for the exploitation of young workers and the creation of this black economy. That is that final link, as we say in the picture, that draws it all together, and why it is, particularly in hospitality, the employers were so keen for the traineeship option and moving away from the apprenticeships, and then using it to justify why apprenticeships have dropped off. Oh, it's because we got more traineeships. Oh yeah, like this. The young worker told us, and backed up by 2-3 of her colleagues, they came into a room, were signing traineeship contracts for 3 years. Some of them were law students becoming trainees in front of house operations at the Outback restaurant and signing those away. Luckily, the law students didn't sign. They actually started reading, and I've got to say, they had 20 minutes in which there was mostly talk, and they were told to sign. They didn't have time to read it because their shift started. And worse, they were not allowed to even take what they'd signed away. So they had no proof of anything, and still have no proof of anything that they've signed. But that aspect, that's the worst. That's the worst, because then you can sort of see how the training system itself reads smart and skilled. And yes, a lot of this happened before smart and skilled, it's true, but it's now gone into a new depth and a new world, really, where basically they're doing it at will. It's brazen. They're unapologetic about it. Even the government's saying they don't see a problem, even though the department tells us privately that they're going to move on the hospitality traineeships because it's becoming too much of a joke. Right? So that's what we've got. I'll leave it there, and apologies if I've gone a little bit over the 15, but it's a fascinating area, and my commendation to everyone who works in that field, because we've got 20,000 young people all looking for part-time work, or most of them. It's an obvious base for organising. And where we have affiliates already based there, like the NTU and most of the campuses, we're working with the campus-based unions. It's an opportunity to work with the student unions and others to maybe look at new forms of organising, based, of course, with membership within the union movement. But we need to face facts, and that is that it's not just the emerging business models that we need to look at, but we also need to look at our own. Right? And learn from some of these things about new ways of actually organising so that we're more effective. Thank you.